Okay, so
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. My name is Pamela Cone, and I am delighted to serve as host of this podcast series. We are so fortunate to have as our guest today Matthew Sekol, Global ESG and Sustainability Advisor at Microsoft, and the author of a book, ESG Mindset, Business Resilience and Sustainable Growth, which is just published and available to you now. Welcome, Matthew.
thanks. It's so much. I'm so happy to be here today.
One of my favorite titles on your LinkedIn page is Benevolent Troublemaker. How did you come to that, and what made you put that on your LinkedIn page?
You know what? Somebody actually called me that once on a call. So I like to take calls on Friday with just random people who reach out to me about career advice, what they're seeing. And oh my gosh, maybe 2 years ago, somebody said, "You really sound like a benevolent troublemaker." Because while I have a role at Microsoft, and my role is really on the commercial side of sustainability, I tend to get into trouble a little bit because I push. Either I push internally at Microsoft, I
Mhm.
push, our partner network, which is where I focus, or I push companies around to say, maybe you need to think about this a little bit differently than what you're thinking about it. And so, yeah, somebody called me a benevolent troublemaker, and I really, really take it to heart. And that is like my favorite part of the job and the work that I do.
And it's the best thing that somebody could have called you, right?
Right.
Well,
Very much so.
let's start. You hinted a little bit at your role on at Microsoft, and I want to get to that. But tell me a little bit first about your career path and how did you even get to Microsoft?
Yeah, sure. So most of my career, well, I graduated university with an English degree. I went right into IT out of college and found that I had an innate ability to communicate more effectively than a lot of the more traditional engineers, because this was in the late 90s. IT was very much, just still getting stood up. I was like the 30th person hired at one international company's IT org. So I found that I was able to effectively communicate, and it kind of gave me an edge in IT specifically. I spent about 15 years there supporting corporates, various industries, and then the company I was working for got bought out, and I ended up moving to a Microsoft partner. Microsoft has always underpinned my career because I was in IT.
Mhm.
I led the services practice at a Microsoft partner for about 3 years, got very close with Microsoft in that way. And then they said, you know what, why don't you come over here? Why don't you come over and join us? You'll be aligned with financial services. And I joined on the commercial side in sales, being kind of, we have a role here that's a technology seller. So I
Mhm.
joined into that role, and I quickly became aligned with capital markets, became a capital markets industry advisor, found ESG, and just was obsessed with it.
Mhm.
From there, when Microsoft didn't have a commercial ESG role. So this is part of the Matt becoming a benevolent troublemaker
Uh-huh,
part,
uh-huh.
because I would talk to everybody about ESG. And then when Microsoft finally commercialized sustainability, I decided to move over onto that team because it was really the closest role I could find aligned with my passion.
So describe to me what you mean by commercialized ESG.
Yeah, sure. So, oh gosh, maybe 2.5 years ago, Microsoft developed a product aligned really where the market was at the time and still kind of is, which we can talk, I'm sure we'll talk about, mostly focused on environmental metric accounting and the pressure from regulators and stakeholders to disclose. And so we have an environmental metric accounting tool called Microsoft Sustainability Manager that does carbon, water, and waste. But we also view this very much as a core data challenge. And I think over the past couple of years, our perspectives at Microsoft, from the commercial perspective, has shifted to, the disclosures are definitely a requirement. Compliance is absolutely a requirement. But in order to move forward with action, companies really need to kind of pull their data together. And oh, hey, we're one of the world's biggest hyperscale cloud providers that have a data platform.
Mhm.
And so these are the types of conversations that I have with companies, that I have with partners who are trying to help companies. How do you wrangle this massive amount of data, look at it through a new ESG perspective alongside things like operational and financial data in order to give the board and management decisions information to make better and more informed decisions, basically.
And so your role at Microsoft is helping the Microsoft partners do that, or helping Microsoft clients do that, or all of the above?
It's a little bit of both. On the team, I specifically focus on partners, but I always, again, the troublemaker, I always get into conversations with clients as well. And it's sometimes like people know that I came into this from capital markets, so they pull me into financial services conversations. Other times, like, hey, Matt, you've been doing this for a while. Can you just join our call and see what this client's saying and kind of suss out, how we can really layer on technology or artificial intelligence to help?
Well, it sounds you have found your sweet spot in your career.
Yeah, very much so. It is fascinating to see everybody's efforts in this space right now.
Yeah.
It's really, it's incredible.
Right. I liken to it, it's no longer a side project, but it is becoming, and I hope I live long enough to see that it is simply business as usual, not something on the side.
Totally.
So
Absolutely.
let's move on to your book, ESG Mindset, Business Resilience and Sustainable Growth. What prompted you to write that book?
Yeah, so when I was coming into ESG, I was supporting some of the world's largest asset managers, some of the recognizable names in the ESG data aggregation and scoring space, and I was just riveted. And
Mhm.
I tend to have a different perspective on like literally everything. I don't know why. So I was looking at ESG and I was thinking to myself, boy, these financial services firms are assessing companies. And I reflected on my career, and there were different points when I found that I was intersectional with ESG, but nobody had ever said ESG to
Right,
me,
right.
right? And so I started doing some self-exploration and learning, and all the books that I found were about the financial services perspective, which I thought was completely odd because financial services firms, whether it's ESG investing, whether it's socially responsible investing, impact investing, whatever, trying to, do sustainable loans, these firms are trying to drive capital to companies that are doing things. So while ESG very much started from the financial perspective, but it really was applied to companies.
Mhm.
But when I was looking around, I'm like, nobody ever went to these companies and said, hey, this is what ESG is. It's a perspective on your risks and opportunities, the ones that impact you, not necessarily your impact out on the world. Now, that narrative did kind of start emerging as a lot of the confusion came up in the 2010s, but it still I never found a resource that was like, this is what ESG is for a company. And so in 2022, I started writing a newsletter, and I still write it. It's called ESG Advocate. It's out on Substack. And it was about 2,500 words every week. And I looked at this newsletter after a year and I said to myself, boy, 2,500 words a week kind of sounds like half a chapter per week. Maybe I should write the book that I was looking for as I was coming into this space.
Mhm.
So that's kind of what I wrote the book about, but that's kind of how I got on the journey of the book.
Yes.
But what's interesting to me is I'm starting, I was wondering if the timing of the book was maybe poor because there's a lot of news articles about, is ESG dying? Is it dead? The financial services firms are saying we're going to stop saying it now, which I have many opinions on. But what I'm finding is companies are actually doing the work and they're starting to go from those disclosures into actually understanding the intersection of these topics at their business. So they're finally starting to come around. And while the book has ESG obviously in the title,
Mhm.
um, I think there's messages in the book that are broadly applicable. And even towards the end, I talk about like maybe it's not ESG anymore.
Right.
Um, but regardless, this was the book that I wanted 5 years ago when I was coming into the space, trying to figure it out from the company perspective.
I think you're absolutely right, and we'll get to this in a little bit, that the phrase ESG may fall out of favor or may go away, but the work isn't stopping. In fact, the work globally is just snowballing, so far as I can tell.
Yeah.
So chapter 3 of the book is titled Saving the Company, Saving the Planet. Mutually exclusive?
Not necessarily, but I
Let's hope
don't.
not. Let's hope not, right?
No. I don't think it is mutually exclusive, but I don't know that companies have been approaching it right. And
Right.
what I mean by that is in the book, and I talk about this not only with the environment, but with other issues like social justice, companies really need to come at these issues in the manner in which they operate,
Yes.
which means anything that you do to try to save the planet is likely going to be a philanthropic effort. It might be transient. If you experience a downturn, you're probably going to stop funding it. But if you come at it from the perspective of, and the use case I write about in the book is from a beverage company. So beverage companies, maybe carbon emissions isn't the greatest thing that they should worry about. It should be water replenishment, because without water, they can't actually make their product. So coming at an environmental challenge from their most material intersection of the environment, which may be water, it could also be plastic, frankly, but coming at it from that perspective and only impacting that environmental issue in the unique way that they can sets them up for a long-term transitional process that actually has an impact. So I kind of feel like companies haven't quite been doing it right, but that they're getting there. They're starting to see, wow, you know what, this climate change thing is really impacting my business. I do have unique intersections to it. Maybe I need to look at my business from those perspectives. And then, oh yeah, you know what, now that I understand this better, let me go out and try to make an impact out on it
Yeah.
from my own risks and opportunities.
Yep. And in the way we do our business, not a side
Absolutely.
project.
Yep.
So
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, not a side project. It is core to your business.
that's right.
Yep.
So chapter 9 is called Criticisms and Controversies
Yes.
around ESG. Should we go there?
Yeah, we should. We should go there. So yeah, ESG has had a rough go in the last 2 years, especially in the US, but bleeding more into the West as well. And it gets hit from both sides. And the SEC is the perfect example, which, you know, the SEC climate disclosure rule dropped after the book was out. And they've now pulled back. And what I talk about in that chapter are the two sides of why the SEC has pulled back effectively, which is activists aren't happy that companies are focusing on themselves first and not the environment, which isn't, or social justice, which isn't necessarily the case. And we had just talked about, I kind of feel like that's changing. And I also really truly believe if they don't come at these issues through materiality and their stakeholders, that it is strictly transient. And I think, and I don't want to get off on a tangent, but I think the diversity, equity, and inclusion pullback, which I also write about in the book, is largely that kind of transience that I really think companies need to avoid. And the second thing is the really strange alignment with politics that ESG hasn't taken, but that politicians have kind of assigned to ESG. Because in listening to like Michael Frerich's talk at the congressional hearings, Jasmine Crockett, who I thought was completely brilliant at the congressional hearings, ESG is about materiality. And for a pension fund, especially, like, it is about long-term, like the book's title is Business Resilience. It is about that long-term resilience. Are you going to be here in 10 years? Because the world is changing around you and you need to change. It's not about punishing fossil fuel firms. It's not about, you know, cancel culture. It's none of that. It is really about how you run your business through this perspective, which is why this is also why the book is titled What It Is, ESG Mindset, because it requires you to have a certain frame of mind in order to address these issues. And so I talk about that a little bit in the book. I try to address it as, you know, it's obviously very difficult to write about something as controversial as those perspectives. I really tried to come at it from a balanced perspective because for states in the US that have high exports of fossil fuels, the energy transition does indeed represent a material ESG risk for these states. And so, you know, I kind of get it. I get why they're pushing back in some respects, not all, because frankly, it is a material ESG risk. So I tried to be a little bit balanced and bring that perspective, so definitely one of the most interesting
Yes.
chapters that I wrote for the book.
And to your point, it is a material risk, but so is doing nothing, right?
Oh,
We're
absolutely.
comparing this to the cost of doing nothing. Yes, there is a cost of doing something, but there is also a cost of doing nothing. And in many respects, that's why I sometimes when I'm talking about it, I don't use the word sustainability because too many people just think that is environmentally focused. I instead use the word viability. How viable is your business
Mm.
to be full circle 10 years from now? That includes environment, it includes social, it includes, the way you're governing yourselves. So to your point that chapter was one of the most difficult to write. What was your favorite thing about writing the book? And of course, I'm going to ask you the flip side question. What was your least favorite part about writing the book?
Gosh, well, so from a personal perspective, I think the best or most favorite thing about writing a book was, look, I was an English major. Like that's what we're supposed to do.
Yeah.
So
Your
writing a
degree has
book was,
come fruition.
yes. So after 25 years of college, like writing a book and coming to fruition has been incredible. My first boss at Microsoft actually told me that I had a unique ability to take in a lot of information, process it, and then communicate it back out in an accessible manner. And so I said to her, I'm like, how do I capitalize on that? Like, what skill is that? And she's like, I'm not sure. And she never really gave me an answer. I feel like this book is like a homecoming to that conversation because I figured out how to capitalize on that unique ability that she called out six-ish years ago.
Mhm.
Um, but my least favorite thing, oh my gosh, it's time consuming.
Yeah.
Um, my kids get up at 5:30 in the morning to get on the bus. So I would get up with the kids, get up with my wife, get them off to school, and then spend the first couple of hours every day writing. And then usually every day, every Saturday and most of Sunday, I would spend writing. So there's like a lot of house projects that didn't get done during the past year. Um, that was probably my least favorite part. And I think the part that my family struggled with the most was the time. It was very time consuming.
And so will you do it again, or is it too early to talk about that?
I think I already have some ideas I'm kicking around. I don't know if I'll do it soon.
Right.
I also have some ideas for a second edition already, because this space is moving so fast, right?
Yeah,
Like I could
absolutely.
easily update every chapter with new use cases, with new information. It's like criticisms and controversies. Even that is evolving.
Yep.
Yeah.
And new regulations every time we turn around,
Oh,
right?
every time.
So your final chapter of the book is called The Future of ESG. So give me a hint. I haven't gotten to that part of the book yet. Give me a hint. What's in the future for ESG?
Well, I'm curious to see what happens. There's two things I'll call out. One is, and I kind of already alluded to this, there is a chance that people will stop saying ESG. Now, I think that that is entirely possible that that will come true. However, throughout the book, what I say is, and this maybe is a little bit of the English graduate in me, I really feel like the acronym is together for a reason. And part of that reason is that these issues flow in and out of each other, which provides you with a specific way to look at these issues or mindset for the book's title. So if we stop saying ESG, I think we lose that perspective. And I'll just give you a quick example. Like it would really be a shame if a procurement team looked at their carbon goals, looked at their look at their supply chain and said, you know what, these are my 5 highest emitting carbon provider or suppliers. I'm going to cut these 5 and I'm just going to go with the lowest carbon providers. In a vacuum, I'm not going to look at anything else. Meanwhile, maybe it's because those top 5 carbon providers are in global south countries without access to renewable energy, and you've just plunged an entire region or community into poverty. At the end of the day, what have you saved without looking at that social perspective?
Mhm.
So I really feel like there's value in the acronym and that the end of ESG can be a thing if it's mainstreamed across the business, but it really needs to be timed well. The second thing is, right now, the application of technology to ESG is very much focused on disclosures. And that data gathering out of purpose-built systems that were not built for reporting environmental or social or governance information is important for businesses to have that perspective. But I'm starting to see it shift a little bit. So, and what I mean by that is technology has an intersection to actually move these issues forward, whether it's something like a material component substitution in some sort of product that you're making, whether it's understanding your employees' productivity levels, are they burning out? Like, there is value in that data that technology can provide. I believe we're starting to see that shift a little bit, where companies are like, all right, I've got, and frankly, it's happened faster than I thought, but we're starting to see companies disclose and now move into this next phase of, wow, what do we do with this data? We just gave the value away to regulators and the financial markets. There's probably value in bringing that data back in and looking at it and maybe baselining it against our competitors, maybe asking our stakeholders what they think, maybe taking advantage of some of the, which I don't quite write about in the book, but maybe taking advantage of some of the new large language models to get a different understanding of some of this data using qualitative information versus the traditional quantitative. Like, I feel like that's kind of where things are going right now. But yeah, who knows for sure, because this space is moving extremely quickly.
It is, and actually using that data to help make decisions, right?
Yeah,
Rather than just gather the data and report, use the decisions in your strategic decision making, or the data.
absolutely.
So I ask this of all my podcast guests. When we talk again in 1 year's time, which I certainly hope we will do, what will have changed?
You know what's amazing to me is there are systemic risks out there that kind of universally impact everyone. I think the energy transition is probably one of the biggest examples. We've been focused on kind of social justice now for 2 years, and that's waxing and waning a little bit. But just to use an example, I think it's interesting to see the push and pull of the energy transition specifically. Just this morning, there was a bank that came out that said that the fossil fuel transition needs to be measured in decades, not months and years. And that's probably very much true. However, I also see articles come out where another country has run on renewable energy 100% for the first time ever. Like, it's so fascinating to me to watch this because we're right in the thick of it. What I expect is going to happen is, in a year's time, I think that energy transition conversation is really going to shift, because there are countries that are really accelerating around that topic in pretty meaningful ways. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that, now, I'm not talking about like I will have solar panels on my roof, which I recently posted about on LinkedIn, which I really would love, but can't seem to figure out. But I think it means that at the kind of macroeconomic level, we're going to have these utilities making these shifts, because there's so much risk with fossil fuel, not only from a carbon perspective, but from a geopolitical perspective, as we've seen in the news recently. I don't think I need to go into that, but also that conversation is now becoming one of energy security, which is super interesting. So I think we're starting to see politicians look at this issue a little bit differently, and we might start to see governments and central banks and the markets actually fund the energy transition significantly. And with the way that the pace of modern technology, I think this is going to just move. I'm hopeful that this moves super, super fast. I mean, even if you consider like artificial intelligence and the application of machine learning and quantum computing to this problem specifically, oh my gosh, there is no shortage of opportunity out there to not only, I mean, banks are focused on making money, so not only make money, but do a responsible and just transition.
Yes. Yes, I completely agree. And you hinted at my final question for you. You said you're hopeful. In this controversial environment, especially here in the US,
Yeah.
what gives you hope?
Man, I cannot get off the phone about these topics. Like, this has been so I moved into this role maybe about 2.5, 2 years ago. I literally can't get off the phone. Like, it's either companies looking to talk about it, it's thought leaders like and doing forums like this. It's getting invited to conferences. People are not only talking about it, they're either doing the work, trying to improve on the work, trying to innovate, or they're just getting started and trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah.
Like, regardless of what they say publicly in this pullback of ESG and green hushing, people are doing the work. Make absolutely no mistake. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, financial markets are starting to pull back a little bit on ESG. And I think that actually makes sense, which I also write about in the book, because they've kind of muddied the waters on what ESG is, what sustainability is, to your earlier point, what it isn't. I think it's healthy for them to kind of back away from it. I'm kind of hoping that corporates and boards really figure this out, which is, again, another reason why I wrote this book. And I think that they are, because there's also headlines that are starting to emerge where companies are starting to figure this out. And there's a little bit of optimism that shareholders are starting to figure this out too, and they're voting in on proxy resolutions accordingly. That in particular, I'm watching that space super closely because I think there's been a number of governance missteps over the past couple of years that are starting to get attention in different ways than they've historically gotten attention. And I think I wouldn't call them activist shareholders, but I think there's more thoughtful shareholders out there who are really getting this topic, and they're voting accordingly. So I think the board is getting their own kind of pressure, getting upskilled on it, understanding the relationship of sustainability, ESG, impact, social justice with their company, and acting accordingly.
And rightly so, right? We boards and directors should not be making decisions, in my opinion, without giving all of these things considerations, because it's their job to make sure the company is viable in 10 years. And you can't make these decisions correctly or informed if you aren't looking at the bigger long-term picture.
That's exactly right. And the long term, I think, is what's going to win out. I mean, these are questions of, will your company be here in 10 years?
Yep.
Right. And these are issues that impact whether your company will be here in 10 years. If you're not thinking about them, or if you pull back, these issues will come for you regardless, which is a really important message, I think, to take to heart. So even if you ignore ESG, even if you buy into the criticism and controversy, ESG issues will come to you in the end, which I think manifests in a really interesting space. Just real quick, climate risk, wildly ignored in favor of carbon disclosures. You cannot ignore climate risk anymore. That is like the bellwether for ESG risk all up.
I completely agree with that. And not only will ESG come for you, but the competitors in other parts of the world who are moving much faster than we seem to be moving, at least from a regulatory perspective here in the US, they're not slowing down. And so they're like light years ahead of us while we try to figure out what we should do about it. And so I think eventually the competitive environment is going to encourage or force boards of directors to make the right decisions, because they can't be left behind.
Totally. I think that's totally accurate.
Wow. Thank you so much for joining us today, Matthew. This is going to be one of the favored podcasts, I'm sure, with our listeners. And again, I just want to remind people the name of your book, ESG Mindset, Business Resilience, and Sustainable Growth. Thank you, Matthew Sekol.
Thank you so much.